Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me this evening for a lovely, lovely story. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, when I was between the ages of 4 and 7 years old, I did seem to have some curious supernatural experiences, but by the time I was 8, this idiosyncratic gift of second sight faded quite abruptly, which was probably a good thing, as I'm quite sure the kids at my school would have found me strangely quirky if I claimed to see things that they clearly could not. So I am glad that the gift never really stayed with me indefinitely. I am most sure I could have ended up having a very lonely childhood, as kids can be cruelly ostracised if they don't conform to traditional childlike stereotypical behaviours, and many of the seasoned mothers at the school I attended, I suspect, would probably have ensured their children did not play with me if they thought I was an oddball or was exceedingly weird. They wouldn't want their kids to be tarnished with that weirdo brush. Children find school tough enough as it is. They don't need to have incongruous nonconformist friends that will set them apart from the other kids at school and make it increasingly difficult for them to fit in. Suffice to say, it can so easily open the door to being bullied or teased, which is something I'm thankful never happened to me. My mother thought that I could have acquired this unusual but short-term psychic gift because I had died for a couple of minutes when I was 2 years old. I had stopped breathing, and my mother could not find a pulse on me. Apparently she screamed so loud that our next-door neighbour was practically breaking down the front door to get to her. She believed someone was attacking my mother, but found my mother upstairs screaming, "My baby's not breathing! My baby's not breathing!" It would seem I nearly drowned in the bathtub when my mother, distracted by a cell phone call, clean forgot I was in the tub for a few minutes. She wasn't negligent because she believed I would be fine. What must have only been a couple of minutes later, the sight that greeted her eyes when she returned to the bathtub was one she refuses to talk about even today, as it was one of the scariest moments of her entire life. She said that I looked like a rag doll floating in the water. My mother could not believe that a little one could drown in so little water, in such a small tub. I was taken to accident and emergency immediately, and fortunately made a full and miraculous recovery. But even when I was 2, my mother claimed I was seeing people that weren't there, and calling out the name Richard, which was the name of my father's father, who had died before I was born. But I hasten to say I had no memory of that whatsoever. One of the most indelible, rather extraordinary memories of this rather bizarre gift of mine began after me and my mother had been visiting Peggy Jo in hospital. She was my mother's mother, and at 6 years old I adored my grandmother. I think me and my grandmother had a great deal in common. We were a lot alike, and pictures of her when she was my age showed me that she looked extraordinarily like me. I was a little thing with long blonde hair, blue eyes and skinny little matchstick legs. Sometimes I looked like my head was way too big for my tiny little body. My grandmother Peggy Jo had been in hospital for a standard hip operation. There was nothing remotely sinister about it at the time. We were promptly assured it would be a relatively standard, straightforward procedure, and would likely give my grandmother a new lease of life, and certainly a better quality one, as she was struggling with her mobility because of the pain. I remember she was excited about the operation, although she had been unduly warned that the recovery might take some time, as my grandmother wasn't a spring chicken anymore. Those were actually the words the surgeon used, which tickled my grandmother pink, as she kept chickens all her life, and when they were old and in poor health, she'd soak their feet and often their entire bodies in Epsom salts, as she found the chickens would regain their strength after a soaking. It really was a miraculous cure for them. She would leave a tray of water saturated with Epsom salts by the chicken coop, so when the chickens felt poorly, they'd go and soak their feet in the water instinctively and feel significantly better. One day we went to see my grandmother in hospital. After she was recovering from her hip operation, she was in good spirits. I remember asking her why she wasn't soaking her feet in Epsom salts like the chickens back at home. "This is different," she told me. The doctors have given me a brand new hip." At the time, my grandmother was 86 years old, and my mother had spoken to the surgeon, who assured us the surgery had gone incredibly well. "Even though your mother is elderly, I am confident she will go on to make a full recovery," he assured us. After I returned home from the hospital visit with my mother, and after she had tucked me in bed and read me a bedtime story, later that night I woke up with a distinct sense that somebody was watching me, and then I noticed my grandmother was standing at the end of my bed. It was very strange because she wasn't wearing her hospital gown, but her favourite dress, which was a black dress with white lilies on it, which she wore with a thin pink belt and pink pearls around her neck. Imagine my bewilderment to see my grandmother standing at the end of my bed, larger than life. Her skin appeared to be glowing. She looked radiant. I knew even at 6 years old she should still be in hospital, so I was befuddled. What was she doing here? And why was she dressed up for Thanksgiving? She was smiling at me with a broad grin on her face. She told me to be a good girl and that she was going away. "But why aren't you in hospital? Why are you here?" I asked her. "Why are you walking around? The doctor said it would take you a while to get better." "I'm not sick anymore," she told me. "I can walk just fine, if you must know. I feel amazing. Tell your mother, will you? And tell her I want her to have my pink pearl necklace. She's always loved that one. She'll find it in the cookie jar in my kitchen." "But you're wearing your pink pearls, Granny," I exclaimed. "How can they be in the cookie jar?" My grandmother grabbed her pearls around her neck and said, "These are just copies. The real ones are in the cookie jar. You'll find them there. I got them as a gift from your grandfather on our first trip to Hawaii, after we were married. They've always been very precious and sentimental to me." My grandmother told me she loved me, and that she loved my mother, and to say she was sorry that she had to go, and could my mother take care of her chickens. She then waved at me warmly, and I sat up in my bed with a start, when I realized my grandmother had walked through the wall of my bedroom, and was gone. Was this some kind of weird magic trick that I didn't know anything about? If it was, I'd like to learn how to do that, I thought. The following morning at breakfast I sat down at the breakfast nook in our kitchen, eating a large bowl of Cheerios with ice-cold milk and a glass of orange juice, and said to my mother nonchalantly, "I saw Granny last night. She told me she's feeling a lot better, that she can walk very nicely now." "What do you mean, Haley?" my mother asked. "Your grandmother is in hospital, recovering from a routine procedure. I'm not sure she's going to be better for quite a while. She certainly was not walking around your bedroom last night, that's for sure." "But she's not in hospital. She was here. She was in my bedroom. She was standing at the end of my bed and she walked right through the wall." "Why did she walk through the wall, Mummy? How could she walk through bricks and mortar? I didn't think you could walk through bricks." My mother looked at me with an ashen face. "Haley, I don't know what on earth you're talking about. Your grandmother is doing absolutely fine in hospital. The surgeon told me as much. I think you dreamt her walking through a wall. It must have been a bizarre dream you were having. Remember, we saw her yesterday at the hospital." It would seem, only moments later, like that inauspicious scene in a movie, when everything becomes ominously quiet, and you're standing on edge, expecting something quite dreadful to happen. My mother's cell phone began to ring, and my mother had a very unfortunate cell phone ringtone that was piercing enough to make you jump right out of your skin. And it did so for the both of us. For a brief moment my mother became unusually still. She glanced down at the number on her cell phone with a wavering reluctance, and I noticed her long, slender fingers began to tremble as she picked up her cell phone and placed it on speaker. "Hello," came the voice. "Please may I speak to Mrs. Janine Caputo?" "Speaking," said my mother, her voice sounding pretty flat, her eyes round, her face white, her body quivering like a jelly. I think my strange revelation of seeing my grandmother walking through the wall had unsettled my mother greatly, and when she saw the hospital was phoning her, alarm bells sounded in her head. As the hospital had never phoned her before at home, she knew it could only be about her mother. "Mrs. Caputo, I'm phoning you from the North Carolina Specialty Hospital. I'm afraid I've got some bad news for you. Is there someone with you at the moment, or are you all on your own?" "My daughter's with me," my mother stammered. She failed to mention that I was only 6 years old. "Good, I'm glad to hear that. You need to have someone around you. There's no easy way to tell you this, Mrs. Caputo, but I'm afraid your elderly mother passed away last night." My mother dropped the phone. It crashed on the floor with a mighty thud. She looked at me through wide eyes. My mother is dead," she said, her eyes almost standing up on stalks. I could hear the voice on the phone saying, "Mrs. Caputo! Mrs. Caputo! Are you there? Mrs. Caputo! Are you there? Will you pick up? I'm worried about you. Are you all right, Mrs. Caputo? Please pick up, Mrs. Caputo." My mother grabbed the telephone. "Yes, I'm here," she said. "There must be some dreadful mistake. My mother had a routine operation yesterday. The surgeon said she was doing remarkably well. I don't understand. There really must be a mistake here. I'm sure you've got the wrong person." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Caputo. I spoke to the surgeon, Mr. Ralph Swanson his name is. He asked me to send you his condolences, and you're welcome to phone him to discuss the matter with him. Your mother, Mrs. Caputo, she was an elderly woman, and surgery does not come without its risks, I'm afraid. Sometimes the body just can't cope with the stress of an operation. You can speak to Mr. Swanson about it if you like." "But she's not dead. She can't be." "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Caputo. I don't know what else to say. As I was telling you, please give Mr. Swanson a call. I'm sure he'd like to speak to you." For a long moment, my mother just stared at me blankly. "She's not dead, Mummy. The nurse got it wrong. I promise you she was in my bedroom last night. She wanted you to have her pink pearls in the cookie jar in the kitchen that Grandpa bought her in Hawaii." If my mother had any doubts that I had seen the apparition of my grandmother, they went away at once. My mother unequivocally knew that at 6 years old, I didn't even know my grandmother's pink pearls were a gift from my grandfather, and true enough, just as I had claimed, they were found in the cookie jar. Suffice to say, my mother did take care of all my grandmother's beloved chickens, and they too joined her at the pearly gates later on in life. But that is a whole nother story. Another bizarre memory of my brief brush with being psychic was when I was standing in a pew in church with my mother. I was about 4 years old at the time, 2 years before the experience I'd had with my grandmother. I refused to attend Sunday school with the other kids. I was naturally very shy, and I liked being tethered to my mother's side. My mother was a religious woman and went to church every single Sunday. Once we were seated in church, I began rudely pointing to a man several seats behind us. He was not particularly old, but in my eyes everyone was ancient, as I was so young. "Mummy, who is the man, the green man?" I said, pointing at the stranger. Everyone turned around in the pews to look at the man that I was pointing at. My mother's face went as red as a field of poppies. She was embarrassed by my inappropriate behaviour. "Why is he green, Mummy?" I asked her.
"Shush, Hayley, be quiet. We're in church, sweetheart. You can't just rudely point at people like that."
My mother mouthed her apologies to anyone in listening distance who may have had the misfortune of hearing my unseemly outburst.
"Sorry about my daughter. She's a little ebullient,"
she whispered. My mother grabbed me by the shoulders, and her eyes burnt into mine.
"Now you listen to me, Hayley," she said sternly. "You don't say mean things about people like that. It's incredibly rude."
"But, Mummy, he's so green. I think he's going to die. He's very sick, like Billy the goldfish was. Don't you remember? He was floating on the water and his body was blue."
"Hayley, I need you to be very quiet, or Mummy is going to get very cross. Do you understand?" She handed me a colouring book and crayons. "Now focus on that," she said, "and be a good girl." I can still smell the wax of those crayons, all these years later. Isn't it funny the things you remember? I was sitting there on the wooden pew, in a small little flowery dress, with my lacy socks, wearing a pair of pink patent leather shoes, and my blonde hair had been tied up into 2 pigtails. I sat there eagerly colouring in pictures of Winnie the Pooh. Occasionally, when my mother wasn't looking, I'd brazenly glance up at the strange green man, whom I noticed had grown greener. My mother slapped me on the knee when she caught me in the act. "Hayley, stop staring. It's rude to stare. How many times do I have to tell you?" Even though I was reticent, I wasn't exactly a quiet child, especially when I was around my mother. My mother continued to lower her voice, with eyes as indignant as a cat's. She said to me obsequiously, "Hayley, everyone is looking at us. It's embarrassing me. Please focus on your drawing. I think Winnie the Pooh would look very good in a red jacket, don't you? It'll make him into a very debonair young bear, don't you think?"
"What does debonair mean, Mummy?"
I asked. "Shh, be quiet, Hayley. Don't speak so loudly. Debonair means stylish, smart." I was to find out later that the green man I'd observed in church had a heart attack the following day, and dropped down dead in his yard when he was tending to his bed of radishes. I never saw him in church ever again, which made me very sad. Even though he was green, he seemed like a nice man. And without the green man around the pews at church, well, they were a lot less colourful, weren't they? As everybody else had normal skin. But for a long time, my mother said, when I drew people, I would draw them with green skin, and it became quite a novelty for me to do. On another occasion, my mother had taken me to my ballet classes. This was when I was almost 7 years old, and is my last paranormal experience I recall quite vividly. I was grievously upset because my pink ballet tights that were brand new at the time had developed a nasty ladder, only moments after I'd started dancing. I'd heard a tear and glanced down at my legs, only to see that my pink tights were ruptured with a long vertical ladder. It was unsightly, and I was gutted. I felt so pretty in my little tutu skirt and leotard, but my ruined tights had messed up the whole look and made me feel very conspicuous, like the ugly duckling in Swan Lake. When my mother, who was watching the ballet class, saw what had happened to my tights, she was shaking her head indignantly. She walked me back to our car. After my ballet lesson was finished on our journey home, my mother was going on and on about how inferior the quality was of products nowadays, and how ridiculous it was for a perfectly new pair of tights to just ladder like that. "They don't make things like they used to in the olden days. This would never have happened when I was a girl," she told me. I remember we were driving home after the ballet class, and before long she was speaking on her cell phone to the ballet shop in town. "Yes, that's right. This is Mrs. Caputo speaking. I purchased a pair of pink ballet tights from your shop yesterday. My daughter, she's only 7 years old and is very slender, well, actually she's skinny, wore them in her ballet class this afternoon. And 2 minutes of dancing, then they were laddered. Now, quite frankly, I am totally appalled. What do you have to say about the poor quality of your merchandise?" "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that is hardly our fault. Your daughter must have snagged them. Maybe she was a bit rough with them. You know what kids can be like. Hardly our fault. We don't take responsibility for items of merchandise that have been badly abused. I'm sorry, but we don't. I think you will find it is your fault. I don't buy my daughter ballet tights for them to rupture like this, when she merely tweaks her legs. It proves that the product is inferior and very badly made. I would like a full refund, please." "I'm sorry, ma'am. We don't refund you for damaged goods. We're not responsible for laddered tights." "Who am I speaking to?" my mother asked. "I'm one of the shop assistants here. My name is Valerie." "Valerie, may I please speak to your manager at once?" "There is no need," said the young lady obstinately. "If there are any problems with the merchandise, people always speak to me." That is not good enough, young lady. I need to speak to your manager at once. There was a delayed hesitancy on the line, the sound of muffled voices in the background, and I heard the young lady saying, "Difficult customer." Finally, a woman's voice answered, "Mrs. Blundell speaking, from Prt1 Pink Ballet Shop. I understand there is a bit of a problem. How can I be of help?" "Hello, this is Mrs. Caputo. I would like to exchange my daughter's pink ballet tights. I brought them yesterday, and 2 minutes in her ballet class they laddered. Now I'm sorry, but that should never happen." My mother was about to have a blowout with Mrs. Blundell, when the woman said very sweetly, "Not a problem, Mrs. Caputo. Bring the tights into our shop, and we will replace them with a new pair for you, or give you your money back, if that is agreeable." "Thank you very much," said my mother. She turned around to me and smiled. "All that fuss about absolutely nothing. Now don't be sad, sweetheart. It's been sorted out. They're going to replace your pink tights for you. Now won't that be nice?" I nodded my head. "I'm very glad to be getting a new pair of tights," I said, and I really was. I certainly didn't want to be ungrateful. But now I was staring bleakly out of the passenger side window, which was covered with a scattering of fat raindrops. Oh dear, look, it started to rain," my mother had said. I was feeling very downcast, because I knew I wouldn't be able to ride around on my small bicycle that my mother had brought me for my birthday when we got home, because it was now beginning to bucket down with rain. It looked like the rain was here to stay, and had married the entire afternoon, and possibly had booked out the evening. It began to shoot down so furiously fast, without apology. The pewter grey sky looked ominously threatening, as the light of the day was cruelly expunged. It had all happened so quickly, a few harmless raindrops followed by streams of spirited water, which unabashedly spurted through the clouds with a powerful ferocity like that of a car wash. My mother's frantic windscreen wipers worked a dime to a dozen, but they were defeated by the irrepressible deluge. You couldn't see a thing through the windscreen, and that was very scary. I could hear a terrified panic in my mother's voice, as the intimidating, unbridled tsunami of water had thrust itself impertinently upon the road, and the torrents of water began to swell up like a river. My mother's tires lost traction and went skidding precariously all over the place, as the car navigated its way treacherously through all this water. My mother was holding her steering wheel so tightly that her white knuckles were glaring obtrusively through the skin. "Oh my God!" she wailed. "Oh my God! This isn't good! This isn't good! We need to stop somewhere! I can't see a bloody thing outside this window! It's a complete nightmare!" My mother was whispering to herself, and she told me later she'd been praying. I could sense we were in trouble, and for the first time in my young life, I was incredibly frightened. It was like all the cars on the road were playing a macabre game of blind man's buff. In the pit of my stomach I knew something bad was about to happen, and the sense of foreboding slapped me across the face like an icy cold hand. I remember I bleated like a sheep and said, "Ma'am! Ma'am! Ma'am!" for no other words came out of my mouth, as they were knotted up in a tangled confusion, like the socks in a washing machine. My mother was driving very slowly, barely inching forwards in the car. We could see nothing beyond flashing lights of someone's headlights. The weirdest part of this whole very distressing nightmare that unfolded before us in a horror movie is that some shameless, unscrupulous drivers, in these treacherous conditions, when you couldn't see a single thing ahead of you, whooshed past us on the road, as if skating on a slippery ice skating rink, all clearly assuming that they were invincible. Moments later we heard it, the ill-fated, prescient crashing sounds of metal against metal. It was the most horrifying sound I have ever heard, that is seared in my memory like an octopus on a fisherman's spear. The objectionable, clamorous, banging, crashing sounds turned my blood icy cold. My mother wisely stopped her car, and through the misty void created by a large curtain of water pounding down in front of us, we heard the intrusive roaring sound of fire engines, policemen and ambulance sirens piercing through the foggy abyss that stretched before us. The vaporous blur of foggy condensation on our windscreen cleared away, as the cheerless rain softened her cruel blows, rather like a hosepipe on full blast, being finally lowered to a more gentle trajectory. I remember through the globular raindrops that spattered over our windscreen, I saw people like hundreds of carpenter ants emerging on the scene of the accident, as if from nowhere. People behind us had stopped their vehicles in the middle of the road and were stepping out of their cars, rushing towards the disaster. That reminded me somewhat of Lego blocks thrown angrily by a truculent 2-year-old kid having a temper tantrum all over the road. It was a scene of carnage and chaos. "Wait there, darling, will you?" my mother said to me. "I won't be long. I just want to see if I can help at all." I had seen crashes like this when I played with my brother and his toy car collection, but I had never observed such carnage play out in real life, even at 7 years old. It left a marked, indelible impression on my mind that I have never forgotten. I think there were 8 cars in the collision. 2 of them were lying upside down. Other cars had smashed into each other quite badly, but it was one car that was so bad it grabbed my attention at once. It looked like a Coca-Cola can that you have trampled on so hard, so that if anything was inside it, it would have been crushed to smithereens. Even though people were flying around the place and policemen were trying to get people to go back to their cars, my eyes remained steadily focused on the crushed, completely flattened car. That was when I saw her. She was wearing jeans and a pink cashmere sweater with pearl buttons on it and white sneakers on her feet. There was blood stains all over her pink sweater and smeared across her face. She looked as if she'd had a nosebleed of some kind. She looked to be in her early 20s. She walked out of the car and I remember my mouth dropped open. How does anyone walk out of something that is so decimated? It made no sense to my 7-year-old brain. For a while she stood there watching the drama unfold, with an apathetic indifference, and then I watched the fire brigade using the jaws of life to rip open the flattened car, and the very same woman who was standing outside the car, watching the accident, was being evacuated from the car. But the body I saw being retrieved was like a squashed insect that someone had trampled on with a heavy boot, and was soaked in crimson blood. It was the same woman with the cashmere pink sweater. How could that woman be lying on the gurney, but also standing outside the smashed car, watching the accident at the very same time? I observed 2 of the ambulance men shaking their heads sadly, while the woman's body was covered with a white sheet. I could not make sense how one version of her was crushed up and motionless, and the other version of her was staring down at her bungled-up body, with so much detachment. I could see people being covered with blankets and some people placed on stretchers, or being taken to the hospital. I remember my mother was getting into the car, and she sank into her seat and burst into tears. "That could have been us, Haley. We could have been involved in that dreadful accident. Oh, my word! And all that fuss I went through about pink tights. Goodness gracious me, what am I like?" I was wondering why my mother was so upset. We were not in one of those bashed-up cars. Should she not be happy? I was to learn that against the odds only one woman died in that multiple pile-up, while others were seriously injured, and one man had to have his leg amputated. It was only when I was older that I fully appreciated that I'd seen the apparition of the woman who died in that accident. But another thing that always perturbed my mind was why did people continue to drive on a road in such terrifying conditions when you couldn't see a thing? I know because I was there at the time. I had heard the cars whooshing past us to meet a very discomposing fate. Did they have a death wish? I would often wonder. 20 years later. It had been a long day, and I slouched back on the couch in my small little semi-detached house in Greensboro, which I shared with my husband Luke. We'd only been married for about 2 years, and my husband worked for accident and emergency at the Annie Penn Hospital in Greensboro, so I knew that it would be a lonely night without him. I settled back to watch television on my own, and found myself becoming drawn into a paranormal program on television, and then all my memories of my paranormal experiences I'd enjoyed as a very young girl came flooding back. Not that I enjoyed them, of course, but let's just say they had become an intrinsic part of me. You cannot divorce yourself from memories like that, which burrow into you like a worm in an apple. It was a gift that had bruised my life so fleetingly.
Granted, I'd always been more intuitive than the next person, but never again had I had any paranormal experiences, and I was glad about that. I was soon being sucked into the drama of what the television host, who called herself Deborah, was saying. "We're standing outside Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins' home here in Greensboro. Mrs. Ivor Jenkins claims that her house is haunted. Can you tell us what is happening in your home, Mrs. Jenkins?" A woman, I guessed, who was in her early 40s, scrunched up her face as she stared obliquely into the camera. "We were informed when we bought this house that it was owned by an elderly couple. The estate agent told us that they had sadly passed away, but they failed to mention that they passed away in this house. I would never buy a property where two people had physically died. Not that I ever believed in the paranormal, of course. It just would not sit very comfortably with me, if you understand. You know what I mean," she told the television host. The glamorous host, with her long sweep of heavily highlighted hair, done in ash browns, chestnuts and blondes, accentuated by her bright scarlet lipstick, smiled warmly into the camera. "I think, Mrs. Jenkins, a lot of people would agree with you on this one. I personally would not be happy to buy a property where someone had recently died. But then again, with some of our old Victorian and Queen Anne homes, steeped in a rich, vibrant history, I am sure many people passed away in these historic homes." "But that's incredibly different," Mrs. Jenkins explained. "I mean, those deaths happened an awfully long time ago, didn't they? The elderly couple's house that was sold to us, well, they died only 3 years ago. Their deaths are very recent. We moved into the house a year ago after the daughter of the deceased put the property on the market. And the moment we moved in, very strange, idiosyncratic things began to happen to us." "Could you tell our viewers, Mrs. Jenkins, what do you mean by strange things?" Mrs. Jenkins shrugged her shoulders awkwardly. She suddenly appeared to be quite self-conscious. She began clutching at her string of pearls in a self-soothing gesture. "Well, it's hard to explain, isn't it? I mean, from the very beginning, the moment we moved in, well, I felt as if I was imposing on somebody else's space, like I was a guest in the property that we'd bought. It was an uncomfortable feeling. I couldn't shake it off very easily. It felt like we were most unwelcome in our new home. The last time I felt like this was when I was in my early 20s, and I was staying at my best friend's home for a few weeks. And her mother clearly resented my presence in her house. Let's just say, even though she never said as much, I could feel that she didn't want me there. That's exactly how I felt when we moved into this property." "That's very interesting, Mrs. Jenkins. So you picked up on a negative vibe, a feeling of being very unwelcome." "Oh, believe me, Deborah, I did. From the moment we moved in, I regretted buying this place. I doubted that I could ever make it feel my own. Now, my husband assured me I was being totally ridiculous. My husband, now don't get me wrong, I love him to death, but he's got the skin of a rhinoceros. He can put his toe in a hot bath and barely notice it's even hot. And he could sleep with sharp needles in his bed and not feel the pinpricks. So, of course, my sensitivity to the place did not go down very well with him. He thought me and my 12-year-old son, Ethan here, were just imagining things. But we were not imagining anything." "So this is Ethan, ladies and gentlemen," said the host. A bashful, shy-looking boy with a long mop of brown hair looked at the reporter shyly.
"Are we on television?"
he whispered earnestly. "Yes, we are," said Deborah. "But don't be shy, Ethan. The camera won't bite. And our listeners are very interested to hear what you have to say about the paranormal activity going on in your home. Did you also feel unwelcome when you moved into this property?" The boy nodded shyly into the camera.
"Well, the man who used to live in this house, he was very angry that we moved in. He wasn't happy at all. He told me it was his house and not ours, and that we needed to leave and get out. He was always shouting and waving his arms around."
"When did this happen, Ethan?"
"Well, it happened all the time. In the end, I had to sleep with the light on in my bedroom because the man did not come into my room when I left the light on. He was very scary, always screaming, 'Get out of my house!' He had a booming voice, you know."
"So you're telling us you actually saw the ghost of Mr. Gupta
The previous resident of the home, I gather that was his name.
All the time,
Said Ethan, staring into the camera nervously.
he would stand at the end of my bed, but his face was very contorted. Do you know what I mean?
So, Mrs. Jenkins, tell me, did your son Ethan here tell you about Mr. Gupta's nightly visits to his bedroom? Oh, yes, he did, all the time. And I believed him, because I felt that man around. On occasion, I could feel him breathing on my neck. Things got significantly worse, when sometimes things were thrown at us from around the house. I would be in the kitchen, and a knife from the butcher's block went flying across the wall. Things were thrown at us all the time, and on one occasion I was actually pushed down the stairs. It's a jolly good job I didn't break an ankle or something. Ladies and gentlemen, we are witnessing what it is like to live in a home where the previously deceased owners are not happy with your presence. Today we have a paranormal team moving into the house for the night, while the owners are away, to see if we can pick up any recordings of Mr. Gupta. I was glued to the programme. I watched the entire thing from start to finish, and it would seem the disembodied voice of Mr. Gupta could be heard on some of the recordings saying, "Get out of my house!" And one of the researchers claimed to have been pushed violently hard by a pair of strong hands. I don't know whether this programme was a little peek or preview, if you like, on what was soon to happen to me. Was it a nudge from the other side, preparing me for an outlandish experience soon to splash itself on the canvas of my life, like a great big blotch of red paint? I could not be sure. So there we are, that's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I'm so excited for you to join me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.